Dear faculty and students, dear friends and colleagues from Bard College, Berlin, dear guests, I'm here as Dean of the Hertie School to welcome all of you this afternoon for a keynote speech from a Hertie School professor emeritus. I'm still not used to saying that word emeritus. I still see Klaus around a lot, in fact, on the topic, the liberal democracy cube under the onslaught of populist politics. Now, his keynote kicks off our joint colloquium on liberal democracy, reconciling liberalism and democracy today, which is indeed in cooperation with Bard College Berlin. The discussion continues tomorrow at Bard College Berlin in Berlin-Pankow, where there'll be a variety of international scholars from different disciplines who will address the tensions between liberalism and democracy. Now, prior registration is not required, and we look forward to seeing some of you there as well as here. We'd like to thank Bard College in particular for the cooperation this semester. It started with a keynote by Ira Katznelson in February, and we'll wrap up with a keynote from Christopher McCredden on Brexit, popular sovereignty, Ireland, and the European Union, which will be held here at the Hertie School on the 7th of May. Today, Professor Offe will address three dimensions of liberal democracy and how they come in conflict with core tenets of populist politics. Now, this is one of those where I could spend the next 15 minutes introducing Klaus, given his distinguished career. I won't do so. I will simply point out, because I think most of you know who he is anyway, that he is indeed a professor emeritus of political sociology. That's the official title here at the Hertie School. He held chairs in political science and political sociology at the universities of Bielefeld and Bremen. Also here in Berlin, Humboldt. I have here at the Humboldt University of here in Berlin. After his keynote speech, the reins will then go to my fellow host this afternoon, Kerry Bystrom, Associate Dean of Bard College here in Berlin, who will moderate and lead the discussion together with Professor Offe and Boris Vormann, who is Professor of Politics at Bard College, Berlin. We will conclude the discussion with some questions from the audience, and there is a reception that is outside here that I would like to invite all of you to. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Claus Offe.
Thank you very much, Mark. It is a great pleasure for me to be here and to talk to you and to find out whether what I propose to do about the new wave of populism, both conceptually, theoretically, and practically, what is wrong about it or what may be right. As you may hear, my voice is not very good today, but I do my best to make myself understood. And if I don't, please raise your hands and I try to improve. There are two ways to critique a political formation, of political force, or political ideology. One is to point out how much it differs from my or our own values and ideological orientations, and to denounce it as ugly and reactionary. That is not the way I want to take today. The other way is to find out about its implicit political theory and argue that this theory, as must be possible of all theories, is mistaken and self-defeating in its practical consequences. And that's what I try to do. I think it's a little more ambitious than the first message, but I try it anyway. What we mean by liberal democracy is a form of political regime that so far has only been accomplished established within states, that is, not in supranational entities such as the EU. It is plainly no longer the only game in town in Europe, as authors writing after 1989 and the end of the Soviet Union tried to make us believe, Fukuyama. The essence of liberal democracy can perhaps best be visualized as a cube that has three dimensions. The first dimension is that of popular sovereignty. I know that you have talked about popular sovereignty with Ira, and this is an endless debate on what it is and what the challenges are and what different authors have thought about it. I'm not entering into that, other than saying that popular sovereignty is the supreme authority in liberal democracies, in the form of the will of the people, as it is often phrased, as the will of the people manifests itself in elections and many other forms of political communication and participation through which political elites are held accountable, thereby making those elites, that is, members of legislative assemblies and governments, representative agents. So, sovereignty creates representative agents. Accountability has the dual meaning of responsiveness, the adoption by elites of empirically given preferences of constituencies as guidelines of policy making, and responsibility, the very important and helpful distinction between responsiveness and responsibility goes back to Juan Linz, I think. And responsibility is, of course, the proactive formulation of policies under the hypothetical assumption that they will later meet with the ex post approval of the popular sovereign because they can be justified by reference to some standard of the common good. So backward-looking, forward-looking forms of accountability. Responsiveness is thus an, if you wish, upward-looking mode of communication, whereas responsibility unfolds in the opposite direction, that is, political elites formulate policies that they expect to be later endorsed by the constituency of citizens. There are a number of well-known problems with the will of the people and the concept I have used so far. First, the will of the people is always an artifact of institutional methods by which it is being observed and assessed. These methods are typically prescribed by electoral laws and laws regulating activities of political parties. For instance, the popular will, as it is assessed through elections, can greatly vary according to whether the will of the people is ascertained through majoritarian or proportional electoral methods, or federal versus unitary, or unicameral versus bicameral forms of the state. Institutions generate the will and regulate the expression of the will. It can also be measured by opinion surveys, the will of the people. The will of the people is an elusive non-entity because of its diversity and plurality and instability in the temporal dimension. Otherwise, if it were stable, we would have to find out about the will once. But we do that characteristic of liberal democracies is the periodicity of elections. and we would not need electoral campaigns if the will of the people were an objectively measurable entity. And it follows that if you claim the will of the people to be both constant and unified and more or less unchangeable over time, that you must make it that way, and the best way to do this is to create the unity of will, is to abandon pluralism and do something about the freedom of media. So only authoritarian methods can unify and stabilize the will of the people. Otherwise, it's a Mercury-like entity that only institutional methods can ascertain at a particular point in time. Second, before the popular will can at all be expressed and assessed, it must be formed through processes of political preference building with their cognitive and motivational components. Political preference formation is partly a matter of strategic action on the part of political parties, of media, educational institutions, and partly the outcome of ongoing processes in which citizens, engaging their reasoning, their notions of interest, and their conceptions of identity, continuously learn and find out about their preferences. That is, whom they should vote for and what policies they support or oppose. These three political resources that citizens have and that I've just mentioned are reason, interest, and identity, and we'll come back to this triplet of resources. There are no others. This all amounts to saying that the will of the people, far from being some unitary, solid, and durable substance that is easily and objectively observed, the will of the people is both an artifact of institutional channels through which it is allowed to express itself, as well as a fluid entity. A fluid entity, something contingent that is subject to ongoing dynamics of formation and reshaping. The second dimension of our liberal democracy cube consists in the constitutional order, specifying, among other things, the rights that all citizens are equally endowed with, and which constitute them as citizens, as the bearers of rights, and the rules by which collectively binding decisions are to be made. And Constitutional Bill of Rights, and the rule of law principles, such as the division of powers and the independence of the judiciary. It also includes the international treaties, conventions, and other legally binding commitments to which nation-states have decided to become parties. The legal and constitutional shell of liberal democracy performs two functions which seemingly contradict each other. On the one hand, by guaranteeing legal rights and entitlements, they enable citizens to engage in all kinds of activities in markets, in politics, in their private life, as family members, as consumers, as worshippers, and so on. On the other hand, so this is the enabling function. On the other hand, they provide for powerful constraints on the kinds of activities they are permitted to engage in, including the beliefs and preferences they are allowed to pursue and practice in political life. The legal order, therefore, has been compared to the force of gravity. The force of gravity allows us to walk upright. At the same time, it prevents us from flying. Even if a vast majority of the population, that is to say, were to favor the open discrimination of some ethnic minority or the restoration of capital punishment, the legal and constitutional order would, in most countries that is, render such preferences and desires categorically inconsequential, and even their public expression illegal and thus punishable. Similarly, most constitutions impose a rigid temporal structure on the political process, which regulates the points in time at which the popular will is allowed to express itself in elections, or by which a new government, the point in time by which a new government must be formed, and many other things. There are time schedules that you cannot change. While in most liberal democracies, these legal and constitutional constraints can be changed and international treaties also terminated or renegotiated, their change has to pass particular hurdles such as supermajorities, which make them rigid at every given point in time. Liberal democracy thrives in a legal shell, the integrity of which is guarded by independent courts. As a consequence, for most of the time, most matters of collective concern are effectively exempted from being decided upon by the people. The third dimension of our democracy cube is stateness, or state capacity. Reminds us of Samuel Martin Lipset, reminds of Fritz Scharf, the concept of output legitimacy, the effective accomplishment of certain policy objectives, is itself a source of legitimacy and stability. Stateness, or state capacity, or governing capacity, there are many names for this. They basically mean the same. Barack Obama's electorally successful, yet ultimately only poorly redeemed campaign slogan is, "Yes, we can." And it addressed exactly the problem of state capacity. Being legitimated by both the will of the people and the legal constitutional order, a state agency must be capable of getting things done. As Jenny Mansbridge has put it very nicely, the issue of state capacity is, how can we coerce ourselves to do the right thing, right? Laws must be enforced, policies executed, taxes collected, peace restored, and programs implemented. More often than not, against the resistance and attempted obstruction of interested non-state actors, and frequently by overcoming the interference or non-cooperation of other states. What is it that needs to be done by the states in effective ways? Well, there has always been a vast variety of collectively relevant issues and challenges addressed by state policy. As Max Weber has pointed out, there's an endless variety of state goals. These can still be categorized, I claim, at the most abstract level as belonging to the two overwhelming state functions of providing security and providing opportunity to citizens. The kind, volume, and distribution of the basic goods of security and opportunity is a matter of ongoing democratic politics, of course, but the state's unrivaled coercive capacity, that is sovereign capacity, to carry out the policies that emerge from politics is a third constituent component of what we mean by liberal democracy. State failure occurs if the state turns out to lack the requisite capacity to provide for security and opportunity-related policy packages, the content of which is defined by the will of the people, as well as by the legal mandates to which governments and state agencies are subject. Only a capable state can be a democratic state. A state that, in contrast, that controls just weights and measures and decides on street names and nothing else cannot be a democratic state. In order to build adequate governing capacity, the state must, first of all, be able to extract material resources, for instance, through taxation, including the human resources needed to staff the agencies that provide security and opportunity. In globalized and financialized capitalist market economies, the extractive capacity of states, and hence their governing capacity, is well known to be in a state of permanent precariousness. What is also needed for the sake of governing capacity are administrative structures that are reasonably immune from the twin pathologies of incompetence and corruption. Absent such immunity, state agencies will fail to engender the trust of non-state actors with which they interact and on which they depend in order to perform effectively. I consider the problem of inadequate state capacity in all of its dimensions just outlined to be the single most serious problem we encounter in contemporary liberal democracies of capitalist states. States are virtually being rendered incapable by social and economic forces beyond their control to continually and effectively fulfill their functions of providing security and opportunity. Without too much simplification, we can speak of a reversal that has taken place and is going on throughout the OECD world. It used to be the case that the market economy was embedded in state-organized institutions and regulations which maintained the upper hand over economic dynamics. This has arguably, and I wish to argue, this has radically been changed, as many observers have pointed out. Today we see states embedded in supranational or international markets, and their governing capacity decimated and undermined accordingly. More specifically, states have themselves become agents competing with other states, with the action parameters of competition being two. First, the unit cost of labor, and second, the level and distribution of taxes they extract from the economy and the debt they incur. What kind of security and opportunity would sovereign and effective states be capable to provide? A short list of answers. Again, there's a variety of items that need to be mentioned. One is military and police protection. The second is social and economic protection. The third is the provision and protection of cultural goods and traditions and facilities such as schools, museums, opera houses, concert halls, universities, libraries, and many others. A decline of state capacity deprives the holders of political power of some of their capacity to act both responsively and responsibly. This can best be demonstrated in the case of political parties. What was once routinely conceptualized as bridges or transmission belts, political parties that is, between society and the state, has largely broken down, according to analysis and empirical research of quite a number of contemporary scholars, and has transformed political parties into entities that are remote from the interests, passions, and reasoning of ordinary citizens who often perceive parties as guided by self-serving and deeply divided elites rather than representative agents worthy of the citizens' trust, confidence, and engagement. Party leaders, be it in government or in opposition, may well do what they can. But given the constraints imposed upon their governing capacity by globalization and financialization, what they actually can do is not enough for them to earn the recognition and support of growing numbers of citizens. At this point, populism enters the discussion. What is populism? I submit that the rise of populism, next to the financial market and fiscal crisis triggered in 2008, that brought into evidence the deficiencies of state capacity in the countries affected, I submit that the rise of populism is the single most dramatic and consequential development in capitalist democracies in the early decades of the 21st century. This is not the place to explore the history and the national varieties of populism. Suffice it here to say that there are three varieties or stages of populist politics. The first is populism in power, as we find in Hungary, Poland, Turkey, the US, and Russia. Second, populism as a power-sharing force in coalition governments of a centrist party, together with a centrist party, as we find it presently in Norway, Austria, Denmark, and Finland. And thirdly, populism as the opposition force and protest movement, fighting and challenging the political establishment, and that is what we find in the Netherlands, France, Sweden, and Germany. The latter often setting in motion the center party's response of preventative assimilation. I limit myself here to highlighting some prominent features and common characteristics of all these three types of populist political forces. First, populism is a highly emotional and often aggressive politics of protest, anger, hate, and fear. It targets many things in Europe, the economic and monetary union, refugee migration, EU integration, globalization more generally. It is a largely negative politics. It's a very valuable Weberian term. Negative politics is mobilizationally successful because a broad alliance of no-sayers is addressed without a positive policy being, and that applies even to governing populist forces who draw their support from a policy of fear-mongering. Hungary would be a good example. I cannot go into this. Populists thrive on fears that they stoke rather than on remedial policies that they are able to offer and advocate. Populist discourse is normatively extremely thin. They do not have an ideology. Passion typically prevails over argument or ideas, and also over interests. UKIP, the British UKIP, United Kingdom Independence Party, is a single-purpose party without more than marginal parliamentary representation, yet full success with its single objective, the adoption of the Brexit strategy. Second, populism relies on a highly personalistic style of political leadership, amplified by leaders' presence in the electronic mass media. They are often not creatures of political parties, but self-made newcomers and political entrepreneurs, distancing themselves, even displaying contempt for virtually all kinds of political ideology. Similarly, the appeal to followers tends to be unspecific in terms of social class, age, gender, and other categories. Leaders communicate with the mass of followers through plebiscitarian acclamation and the physical presence of followers at mass gatherings. Remember inauguration of Trump. Followers are addressed by the use of social media, the US president addressing the public on Twitter, so as to bypass the counterbalance the critical reporting of quality mass media. Populists favor referendum and other tools of direct democracy as the preferred method of establishing the presumed authentic will of the people. That will is conceived of as a homogeneous unity deriving from shared ethnic and nativist identity, which does not allow for legitimate dissent and a plurality of opinion. This is a point stressed by Jan Werner Müller, one of the most notable researchers of the political theory of populism. If dissent occurs and cannot be denied, it is stylized as the dissent between righteous and true and faithful Poles or Finns. The True Finns is a party, versus degenerate and corrupted members that unfortunately are also part of the political community, as has been argued by the Polish leadership of peace. This framing of dissent in terms of righteous versus corrupt paves the road for authoritarian policy measures, as we see them adopted wherever populists gain governing position, as in Poland and Hungary, Russia and Turkey. The reverse side of the coin of personalization of leaders is a demonization of enemies. Whatever goes wrong must be attributed to someone's evil design and intent. When a dozen people died in a terrorist incident committed by an asylum seeker in Berlin in December of 2016, the Populist Party declared, "Those are Merkel's dead." Thirdly, there is a reliance on a rhetoric of provocation. Normative standards of political correctness, civility, decency, good taste, nonviolence, respect for opponents, moderation, are systematically violated so as to demonstrate leaders' complicity with the supposedly vulgar styles and gut feelings and habits of their constituents whose justified anger supposedly does not allow for the niceties of conventional elite discourses. Fourth, the social and political world is framed by populists as consisting of two front lines, and that is one of the most important feature. Two front lines beyond which our opponents, or rather enemies, are to be located. One front line is the vertical divide between us and the establishment, which includes not just the political class, but all kinds of intermediate or mediating institutions, such as mass media, experts, academia, the judiciary, professions and their organizations, faith-based and other civil society organizations. The other front line is the horizontal one between us and foreign items to be kept out. People, races, ideas, investments, contagious diseases, crimes, Brussels, foreign goods and foreign gods need to be kept out. Even in one case that I've observed to my amazement, a polemic against, in Germany, a polemic against speaking English that is considered a suspicious cosmopolitan habit that we better should limit as far as we can. Because it's also socially inequality promoting, because some speak English, some don't. Rather than having everyone learn English, the opposite conclusion is drawn. The capacity to speak English should be minimized. That was the argument of one leading AfD functionary that I heard argue that way. Okay, the latter front line, the we versus the outsiders, manifests itself to varying degrees in tendencies of nativist xenophobia, insisting on the jus sanguinis doctrines of citizenship, an ethnic understanding of the national community, and its lead culture, a special German term, Leitkultur, that has caused a lot of debate and in fact, a non-entity. A Leitkultur that is to be protected through walls, fences, and exclusionary legal provisions. This new and often aggressive insistence on the protection of ethnic identity must clearly be seen as a widely popular backlash to the experience of neoliberal globalization and migration. The former front line, the vertical, that between the people and the establishment, derives its plausibility and mobilizational potential from the experience of and frustration with vast and widening inequalities of resources, of security and opportunity, as well as the manifest failure of political elites and incumbents of state power to reverse these trends, or at least bring them to a halt. So here you see the interaction between what I called failing state effectiveness and populist mobilization. These socioeconomic frustrations have joined forces with the cultural fears of parts of the middle class that suspect liberal political elites of being inappropriately open vis-à-vis forces of secularization and modernization, to say nothing about multiculturalism. The dual opposition of the people versus hostile foreign forces and the people versus the corrupted establishment serves to crystallize an essentialist definition of us, the people and its legitimate will. And at the beginning, I've started to argue that such essential entity does not exist. This will, other than under authoritarian creation of it, this will is claimed to be homogeneous, based upon a deep and authentic, true, genuine, shared sense of identity. Populists in power, that is those in much of the Anglo world and those in Central Eastern Europe, in the new member states of the EU, as well as arguably more and more Austria, as well as populists in opposition, as they have achieved partly massive electoral gains in all old member states of the EU, arguably with the sole exception, an unexplained exception, of the two member states on the Iberian Peninsula, where they don't know what it is, what we're talking about. Amazing. They have used their propaganda rhetoric, in their propaganda rhetoric, the distinction between true, authentic, and deserving members of the nation versus a kind of internal defectors, if not traitors, like British judges, according to the Daily Telegraph, who fail their ethnic duties to their homeland by advocating liberal principles of equal citizenship rights of every holder of the national, and for that matter, European passport, with the move of dividing the nation into segments, that is, in a segment that is loyal and deserving, and another one that is not. The second dimension of the liberal democracy, that of constitutional rights and rule of law, is openly being violated by populist political forces in power. Moreover, the legitimacy of dissent and pluralism is denied to those who are not recognized as true Finns, Poles, Germans, and so on. The authoritarian implications of such denial are obvious. They start with attacks on the freedom of the press and of opinion, continue in the violation of rule of law principles, and end up, for the time being, in government's interference with independent activities of civil society organizations, such as foundations working on cultural, academic, and charitable projects. The most dramatic example, perhaps up to date, being the CEU in Budapest, Central European University. Further steps in the direction of authoritarian rule include the condoning of, and there are three criteria once developed 40 years ago by Juan Linz, and they apply amazingly well today. The three criteria for authoritarian change are: first, the condoning of political violence by elites; second, the criminalization of opposition; and third, the questioning of the validity of perfectly clean electoral outcomes. All three of them have been used by the US president after the election. The second in instigating a mass movement on lock her up, Hillary, lock her up. At the same time, the first dimension of our liberal democracy cube is also affected. As I've pointed out before, a democratic conception of the will of the people recognizes that will as malleable and open to change through experience, through learning, through persuasion and deliberation. Also, the institutional methods by which that will can be ascertained and the ways by which it is being shaped are open to legitimate controversy. Illiberal Democrats, such as populists, disagree on both points. According to them, the will of the people is thought of as deriving from a substantial identity, is stable over time, and can be assessed by providing people with opportunities to express their unreflected unreflective gut feelings through referenda. As to the third dimension, the issue of state capacity, the populist vision of a strong and benevolent state that is capable to care for the needs of the citizens is essentially authoritarian. State capacity or state strength is equated not with the continuous building of alliances, coalitions, and the cooperative processing of conflict, but with the effective ban on dissent and of opposition forces and civil society activities. State strength is conceptualized as a monopoly of one force and the repression of everything else, whereas a more adequate, more effective, more proven way is the organization of cooperation among societal forces with different interests. What the state needs to do in order to provide for the security and opportunities of its natives is not primarily to mobilize the requisite resources, including the soft power of trust and voluntary cooperation that are needed for active intervention, but to close borders and to deter the undesired inward crossing of borders by people, goods, ideas, and political decisions, namely those coming from Brussels. Now I come to my conclusion. Populism, international cooperation, and EU integration. We seem to have arrived in an age of non-cooperation, where the world is framed as a zero-sum game immersed in moral hazard psychology. There is a new ethos of going it alone, of resentful unilateralism, of putting ourselves first, and of taking back control of our country, as in the Brexit campaign. The cancellation of international agreements, Paris Agreement, Iran Agreement, and the secession of regions seem to have become quite popular ambitions, where identity, passions take precedence over both interests and reason, as I think we can see in Catalonia. In other policy areas, populists oppose the common monetary regime of the euro and have obstructed, that applies to the Visegrad Forum, in violation of decisions of the European Court of Justice. They have obstructed the burden-sharing arrangement among EU member states in the field of migration and refugee policy. The contradiction of international politics in general and that of the Atlantic space in specific, as I see it, is that of two simultaneous movements pulling policy in opposite directions. On the one hand, there is an irresistible and irreversible trend of globalization and growing interdependencies. I describe this as a growing long-distance causality to which no state, corporate actor, or even individual person is immune, be it in the economic, commercial, financial, military, cultural, environmental, technological, migration dimensions, and many others. Whatever we do, we affect knowingly and intentionally or otherwise very remote other agents, be it remote in time or be it remote in space. We also generate, or at any rate, face challenges that require large-scale cooperation. In order to be coped with, as these challenges are too big to be dealt with at even the level of the biggest state actors. Examples are climate, other types of environmental challenges, monetary policy, taxation, migration, energy, trade policy, R&D, intellectual property, international security, development, the control of terrorism, of disease and crime, and many others. If we want to succeed, we need to pool resources, merge competencies and responsibilities. In all of these areas, there are clear and substantial costs of the strategy of going it alone and unilateralism. Could it be the case that the only way to counter the decline of stateness is by resorting to a kind of member stateness that institutionalizes border-crossing cooperation, thereby re-embedding the economy in a regime of supranational regulatory control. On the other hand, the readiness to heed the imperatives of such cooperation dwindles under the impact of the particularism and populism that I have described, the new sovereignty parochialism. The objection to illiberal democracy is not just that it is not democratic in any liberal sense. The additional objection is that it tends to sabotage the kind of border-crossing cooperation on which state capacity is irrevocably premised. The retreat from cooperation and collective action also demolishes the underpinnings of the liberal international order, consisting in open borders, human and minority rights, and international organization. Is there any resolution to the contradiction between the growing need for cooperation resulting from complexity, interdependence, and long-distance causation, and the declining supply of cooperation and the readiness for the pooling of resources and sharing of responsibilities that is promoted by populist mobilization? If there is one, it starts with a simple insight that, however, is extremely hard to follow in the climate of populism and the proliferating cult of going it alone. This insight, I suggest, is this: sovereignty, that is our state capacity to cope with problems, risks and challenges affecting all of us beyond our borders, can actually increase when nation states are ready to give up parts of it for the sake of cooperation. They can master these challenges only if they give up the ambition to mastering them alone. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Offe, for that very lucid mapping, both of what liberal democracy is from a conceptual level, the dynamics of populism that are attacking it today, and in fact, some somewhat hopefully positive responses to it. So we can hopefully talk about that a little bit more about what we can do, really, in the face of everything that you've been mapping for us. I also want to thank, on behalf of Bard College Berlin, the Hertie School, of course, for their cooperation in this event today, the staff members at Bard College Berlin who have been instrumental in making it happen, Irina Stilea and Benedetta Rue, and certainly we cannot fail to mention Professors Michael Weinman, who's back there, Eva Atanasso, who's over there, and Boris Vormann, who were the masterminds of this project. Certainly without them, this event would not be happening, and we're so thankful for their initiative on this front. My name is Kerry Bystrom. I'm the Associate Dean of Bard College Berlin, and I have the pleasure of moderating the discussion that will take place right now. We only have about half an hour before the end of the session, so I would like to introduce very briefly Professor Dr. Boris Vormann, who will be giving short remarks of about 5 to 10 minutes to Professor Offe's lecture, and then we'll be opening the floor for further questions. Boris Vormann has been now almost a year as professor and head of the politics program at Bard College Berlin. Before that, he was a visiting professor at the John F. Kennedy Institute at the Free University here in Berlin, as well as a visiting professor at many institutions, including Harvard University and NYU Berlin. He has published also a very long list of publications and has many media appearances. So let me only mention one here. It's the most relevant, and it's a co-authored piece with Christian Lammert, who may well also be in the audience tonight, called The Crisis of Democracy and How We Overcome It. So hopefully that last part, how we overcome it, will also chime nicely with Professor Offe's suggestions at the very end of the lecture today. So let me hand over the podium to Boris for his formal response to the lecture, and then, as I said, we'll have Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kerry, for these very kind words. Thanks also, I'm very humbled to speak after Professor Offe. I'll be very short, and I'll try to summarize my thoughts. I've been revising and rethinking while I was listening to the talk, but I have 3 comments. And let me say right away that I see this more as an icebreaker, right? And I agree with the general assumption of having arrived in an age of non-cooperation and a zero-sum game, and also sharing the fears of authoritarianism. So I agree with much of the analysis. So the 3 comments I make are perhaps questions of clarification and complementary, I think, to the argument. The first point addresses the argument itself, or an important part of the argument, which I took to be sort of the main thesis of the talk, that the rise of populism as a set of different processes or attacks of isolationism, protectionism, unilateralism, and nationalism have risen over time and have put the liberal order, or the democratic cube, the liberal democracy cube, under attack. Well, I think this has 2 implications that I would like to comment on. The first one is that, isn't that exactly the kind of critique that the populists make of liberal democracy as well? Right? That liberal democracy is basically what's responsible for putting popular sovereignty, the constitutional order, and the adequate governing capacity under attack. So isn't that part, is that not the same type of criticism, that liberal globalization, so not isolationism and protectionism, but free trade, not unilateralism, but multilateralism, not nationalism, but cosmopolitan globalism, has undermined popular sovereignty and has misused governing capacity, and by collateral damage has also threatened the constitutional order. So if the key argument is that populism produces the same kind of outcomes, basically, that it propagates to overcome, which I took to be a second step in the argument, does that put us in front of perhaps what could be a false dichotomy between liberal democracy and populism alone? And that brings me to my second point, which is a question of framing. What exactly is the crisis here? Is it populism, the rise of populism, the wave of populism? Or might there be something immanent to liberalism that might be part of the explanation of the crisis as well? Oftentimes, there are some, in public discussions, there are relatively biologistic metaphors used to explain the rise of populism as a pandemic that is spreading. It's almost it's a sickness that is emotional, an emotional eruption that's coming over us. It's a backlash to Obama, it's a backlash to postmodernism, it's some kind of a postmodern fatigue. And as I took the explanation or the cause to be pronounced in the lecture, that was one part of the explanation, the other one was a lack of governing capacity. But perhaps there's something in liberalism itself, in liberal philosophy and in liberal practice, that also gave rise to the crisis of liberal democracy. And I think it's important to point that out because when we're thinking about overcoming the crisis, I think the causes need to be addressed. It's true, the crisis itself is metamorphosing, and the nationalistic aspect of it and the authoritarian aspect seems to become more and more important. But the root cause, I think, is an imminent crisis, an imminent contradiction of liberalism. And to be more specific, a contradiction in liberalism between economic liberalism and political liberalism. So on the one hand, the assumption that market efficiency is the best way to organize societies, so a call for the expansion of markets in economic liberalism. And on the other hand, political liberalism as a notion that diversity and pluralism of opinion is something that should shape societies. And I think what caused the crisis on a philosophical level is the assumption that both these dimensions of liberalism automatically always go hand in hand naturally. That assumption was stressed even more after the fall of the wall, where it seemed to become a practical truth, where with the rise of liberal capitalism on a global level, the assumption became stronger and stronger that market expansion would also lead to democratic peace, basically, to say it bluntly. What I think this has done is to undermine the values of political liberalism, to hollow out the values of political liberalism, especially after the hits of the 2007 financial crisis. So once this didn't seem to hold true anymore, there was a problem. The problem became visible and tangible. And I think this is what we're still trying to recover from. I'm going to stay short here because Christian is also going to talk tomorrow, and he's going to do the second part of this argument, so I'm not going to exaggerate. So the second point, the crisis itself might not come above us from the outside, from populists, from erratic people that somehow strengthen their position, but it comes from the inside of liberalism. So liberalism might have to be fixed. The political values of liberalism might have to be restated as values in and of themselves, rather than as collateral damage of market expansion. I think that is a fundamental point. And the third point is on the constraints of governing capacity of the state under globalization, and this notion of irreversibility of globalization. I think that this story is part of the problem of liberal democracy, that there's a notion that there is an inevitability, that politics is inevitably needs to follow the logics of the market. And I think that's the story of embeddedness of markets and re-embedding markets. So I very much agree with the notion that there needs to be a new social pact on a different level from the nation state in order to re-embed markets. But I think we could be even a little more aggressive in the argument against this notion of state incapacity. Are states, are nation states really as innocent in globalization and as passive as we think? You pointed out the important functions, police functions, military functions, and I think there has been a very important literature that has emerged in the last 10 years or so after the financial crisis that's pointing out that the state is not just a market fixer, so it's not just stepping in to bail out markets after financial crisis. It's not just a market facilitator that ensures contracts and creates property rights or enforces property rights or creates stable currencies, but that it's also a market enabler and a market maker, that the state is very active in producing globalization, right, through infrastructural networks, for example, pretty hidden investments in the architecture that's necessary for globalization to work. And so I think a main problem with that is that the state seems to persist in very important ways in very different dimensions, but it has become invisible and unaccountable. And so this question of a lack of responsiveness is aggravated through this hidden action, through public-private partnerships and indirect investments, technocratic investments in the infrastructures of globalization. So maybe it would be important to rethink globalization as something that's not necessarily inevitable and that can be shaped by states in order for us to hold political actors accountable. And I'll stop there. And
very briefly, I think these are very helpful ramifications of the argument, and sometimes a correction of the argument also. I mean, what I have not highlighted in sufficient ways is states as active agents in the process of globalization, financialization, and independence, which has a suicidal element to it. States engage in activities in the building of structures and the building of markets that subvert their own capacity to act in the future. And I mean, the tax reforms that in Germany were adopted in 2002 and 2003, and the Schröder, Social Democratic Schröder administration, unbelievable in that they thought minimizing the tax burden on investors is a good idea. And the investors did what they wanted with it without. Anyway, it's many symptoms of state failure have to do with the competitive lowering of tax burdens, and investors can do what they want, and the inability to come to a monetary regime in the European Union, or the Eurozone rather, which would prevent the repetition of financial market crisis through the completion of the banking union is another example of massive state failure that could have prevented at an earlier point, and God knows whether it can be ever corrected. So I very much agree with this. I mean, the broad critique of liberalism, that has a economic branch, market liberalism, and a political branch, political liberalism, that cannot easily coexist and establish a permanent tension. I also agree, but that is outside of my topic. I agree very much. But what I meant by the three dimensions is, of course, the three powers. The first is the parliamentary representation. The second dimension is the judiciary, and the third is the executive branch and what I'm interested in, and I have given an outline of, is the interaction between the weakness of the executive branch with the weakness or the undermining of the representative branch, a democratic branch, about which the judiciary is not able to restore a balance. Right? That is the misery of contemporary liberal, and the huge opportunity for populist movements.
If I may just exercise my right as moderator to ask the first question before opening up to the floor. I see someone already ready to jump in there. I just want to throw in another term, or highlight another term, democracy, right? Actually, we've been talking a lot about liberalism and populism. The conference is called Illiberal Democracy, Reconciling Liberalism and Democracy Today. And I noticed that, in fact, the term illiberal democracy only came up once in your lecture. So I'm curious about that. Certainly, you mentioned Jan Werner Müller, who recently came out with the position that we shouldn't, if I'm interpreting it correctly, shouldn't be sort of dignifying these regimes that you talk about. with the term democratic. I was speaking with a friend and Russian human rights defender last night who also insisted that Russia not be called an illiberal democracy, but electoral authoritarianism. And I'm interested in your opinions, both of you, on this question, at least to try to begin a thread of discussion that we might be able to carry on tomorrow. Where does democracy fit in to all of this?
Okay, I meant to put the illiberal democracy, which is a quote from Mr. Orban, into distancing quotation marks, right? And I should have done so by gesturing like this. It is, of course, a nonsensical term, an oxymoron. Arguably, if we build a concept of democracy that has all three elements, or the first two elements, namely judicial or constitutional rather, and legal constraints to the options that citizens may follow, but at the same time opening opportunities. And the use of these opportunities can always be not conducive, to put it mildly, to the exercise of executive power. I mean, you may use your rights in ways that are highly unwelcome from the point of view of public policy goals. That is fairly familiar, and the challenge for the judiciary, again, is to compatibilize the two. The requirement of effective pursuit of public policies and the liberty of citizens to do what they want within the legal constraint, which need to be considered a moving target, right? Sometimes the liberties, in particular economic liberties, are granted to an extent that make governing hard and virtually impossible. And it is, I mean, the key role of courts and also legislation, but courts, constitutional courts, to balance these two sides.
Thank you, Kerry. This is a great way to articulate a teaser for you to all come to BCB tomorrow, because this is, of course, the question that we're trying to tackle. I agree that it's a nonsensical word, just as sovereign democracy or different types of brands of democracy are problematic. I guess the reason we used it is to point out a certain tension, and I think it can also be used in a productive way, this kind of term, to think about varieties of democracy. So one of the big questions I think we're going to ask tomorrow is, are the differences we see in different geographical areas, in different national contexts, are they differences in degree, or are they differences in kind? If there are differences in degree, maybe we can think about different, items that we want to recognize in a liberal democracy. You could almost make a checklist, right? Elected officials, periodic elections, certain responsiveness of the elected officials to the popular will. And so I think maybe we could try and think about clusters of democracy and how they relate to certain national cultures, institutional path dependencies. So in that sense, I think it can be a productive term, even though in and of itself, it's a very problematic one.
I raise the question now only because in the spirit of saying there can sometimes be problems, or part of the problem might be coming from within liberalism itself. Certainly part of the problem, I would suggest, perhaps, based on my expertise in Southern African and Latin American studies, is the extent to which democracy as a term has also been corrupted by sort of unscrupulous usages during democracy promotion campaigns. And I'm not sure that I would say that's inherent in the concept of democracy itself, but certainly in the concept that democracy is about voting, which you've so clearly and convincingly shown is not the definition of it. But it is, I think these are things that we might, want to have, ideas and genealogies of democracy we might need to have in the discussion.
Maybe just to add one minor point, maybe it would make more sense to talk about undemocratic liberalism, because that seems to be one major problem, that economic liberalism seems to thrive, but political liberalism is what's thrown under the bandwagon. So, yeah, maybe that's...
That's what Jan Werner Müller discusses in the recent essay you were referred to.
So with that, let me open. I saw a very first question right here.
Thank you so much, Klaus. That was the most compelling of many compelling lectures I've heard from you. And it gives us an enormous amount of food for thought. And I'm Patricia Springborg from the Centre for British Studies at the Humboldt. And I felt very sympathetic towards your modifications. There's, however, a dimension to this that I think is missing, and that is that Noel Malcolm gave a lecture to the Royal Society, Historical Society of London, on Hobbes as a liberal illiberal, which I thought was rather good. But there's this story of the rise of populism and the failures of liberal democracy. What we're hearing, I know this is not intentional, one can only talk about so much at one time. It's a story about the West, but where are the rest, to use this term of Huntington? What we're talking about is a form of neo-colonialism that is not only suicidal, but murderous. So many people have died in these punishing colonial wars. 5 million Iraqis have died since the 1990s for no reason whatsoever, except the fight for fossil fuels. Millions of people have been put into a new form of slavery so that we can have globalized Klamotten that you could pay almost nothing for. If you look at this as a form of neocolonialism, it fits into the pattern of punishing wars, the mass migration of refugees, that only increases in scale with our technological capabilities, but is not different from the Roman imperial wars, the British imperial wars, and I truly believe that these problems have to be seen in that context, and then they are more familiar than we think.
Thank you. I see that we have only 10 minutes left in the schedule, so what I'd like to do is keep that question. I see there's one more right in the front and one more. We'll have responses, and then hopefully we can do one more round of questions after that.
Well, thank you very much. My question is with regard to the third dimension of your cube with the state capacity. So I agree with the diagnosis, with the analysis, and saying what we have are now states embedded in international markets. And I also agree with your comment that it were the nation states actually who pushed that. But now the question is, when we think what to do about it, the nation states are actors. These are the elites. They have profits from that. They just don't want to reverse it. Many of them, you cannot expect that they just think of the common good and to reverse it. So who should be the actors who turn this around again? This will be very difficult if we follow Claus Offe with his final remarks to say now we have really to share sovereignty to solve the problems. Who should be the actors? Nations are very abstract. And the elites, the criticism, of course, of populism against these elites and this principled criticism, there is a reason to that. This is also why we have, where the opposition is, we have movements now like Macron. Who would be the actors to reverse this development?
Yes, please.
This is to both Mr. Offe and Mr. Vormann. I'm wondering if you agree with the statement that there is a certain fear within both non-populist parties and in academia in much of what you could call mainstream society to acknowledge the problems that populists acknowledge. And therefore, Mr. Offe, you said that populism strive on fear, not on policy. But wouldn't you agree that when it's only populist parties left who vocally speak out against issues with, as Boris mentioned, within perhaps inherent in liberalism and with globalization, financialization, immigration, etc., when there's only populist parties who speak out and non-populist parties are scared of this, perhaps this notion, and they therefore dare not to acknowledge it, don't we end up with simply just having populism as an only option if you, as a voter, want to have these issues acknowledged and taken care of? Thank you.
Thank you. So, Professor Offe, Professor Vormann, perhaps you can respond.
Well, let me start. Let me start with the last remark. I mean, that sounded too pessimistic and too much giving up the liberal option. Right? The populist movements are far from winning, even where they have won a government position, as in some of the Visegrad states. They don't know what to do, and they're under extreme pressure because they have, I mean, nationalism is also must be looked upon as a policy pathology, right? They do not realize that they depend upon others, and others depend on them, and that this relation can be easily brought out of equilibrium, right? I mean, okay, the case of Hungary is particularly interesting, but I'm not going into this. According to one statistic, just to mention one figure, 40% of the Hungarian manufacturing sector is owned or co-owned by German companies. If they get in conflict with the German companies, there will be a backlash of highly undesired kind. So the economic internationalism, the interdependencies, the long-term, long-distance causation that has already been built into the system will work as a stop rule for the excesses that we see at the present time, and will lead to serious frustrations of some of the constituencies. So I doubt this, that they don't. You seem to imply that they have the right questions and maybe false answers, but I think also the questions are deeply wrong for the reasons I gave. Yeah, Christine Landfried, who has the forces? What is the learning capacity of political elites confronting the situation, which in its description is not really controversial, I think. Well, it depends. I mean, political elites, particularly after they have lost elections, can be ready to learn but both the political and economic dangers of non-cooperation, of going it alone, of isolationism, and so on, can be pointed out to them by people like us in this room, and by the media, and by associations. The other day I attended a discussion on the future of the Eurozone, and I was surprised by the readiness of prominent participants in that discussion to very seriously consider Macron's proposals, although I would not have expected this, that the popularity of Macron, or the popularity of making proposals like that for enhanced cooperation, the popularity of such proposals, and I found that encouraging. I mean, who knows what will come out of this? But the awareness that this cannot go on in this particular field, and with this imbalances of exports, Germany having running a surplus of export of 8.5% of its GDP. This is an unstable situation, and that learning and innovation and new initiatives are required seems to be quite obvious, and the populists have nothing to offer in that field. So it all depends on political forces in power. I'm speaking about the German case. Thank you for your compliments, and for also widening our view to the parts of the world on which we are dumping our negative externalities, and at the same time building a fortress Europe or fortress OECD world, not allowing them to compete on a reasonably level playing field. Again, that will have repercussions in the form of migration pressures, in the form of military and other conflicts in the countries and regions involved that run beyond the capacity of OECD worlds to cope with and to manage. So they will have to enhance their capacity to do so. There is a saying, après nous le déluge, after us the what is it? Deluge. There's a new book by a friend of mine, Stefan Lesenich, who said, besides us, a deluge, right? It's contemporary. And it's not just later. Externalities, I mean, and he has good examples in that. Externalities are devastating.
Yeah, maybe if there's something positive in us realizing that there are these global production networks, and that these costs are being shifted to other places, and that there is deep inequality that's being reproduced through these kinds of political practices and power imbalances. Well, perhaps that could be a way to at least realize what the problem is, right, and try and overcome it, speaking of the emancipatory subject or actor. But one thing that's a problem, perhaps, is that, of course, imperialism is a term that contradicts the notion of American exceptionalism. So the US is exactly not imperial, or at least after the 19th century has taken the stance that it wasn't, because it wasn't taking colonial, it wasn't annexing colonial territories anymore after the Spanish-American War. And so was basically governing through the world market. And so perhaps we're seeing these imbalances more clearly now. On the other hand, what seems to be happening is also that we have economic shifts that are going on, and if there's the rise of new patterns of economic organization in the sharing economy or in the smart economy or whatever you want to call it, it seems like these global supply chains aren't as important anymore as they used to be. It almost seems like we've hit the peak of globalization. So many economists already see that through automation and through e-commerce, you need warehouses that are close to market. So proximity to market becomes more important to rapidly deliver goods. And so the hope that global production networks and global trade would lead us to global peace, the argument for global peace will have to be made without economics. And so this is another reason, I think, why it's important to make a political argument about democracy and global equality. The emancipatory actors, yeah, that's a difficult one, of course. That's a tough one. What we're trying to do in the book, because we have the subtitle, "And How to Overcome the Crisis of Democracy," and we accepted to use that title, even though it's problematic for different reasons, which I'm not going to explain here. What we were trying to come up with was a similar idea of supranational entities on the one hand, as unlikely as they seem right now, because this seems to be also a moment for big thinking. We are in a fundamental crisis, so maybe we have to pronounce visions that are not just fine-tuning and sticking to the same kinds of concepts. But what we're also trying to say is that perhaps it's about the allocation of certain resources and public goods. What kinds of goods need to be decommodified? What kinds of goods can be offered on different scales other than the national? And there seem to be some public goods that have to be organized on a global level, some public goods, like environmental goods or security, some public goods that might have to be organized on a regional level, so subnational regional level. Logistics, organization of logistics is one example. And some might be, well, it's up for debate, basically, is what we're saying, right? We could imagine some kind of a subsidiary global federalism, without calling it a world government, that allows for more legitimacy for political action and direct participation, without just narrowing it down to the smart city, as many people do, right? The smart city. Then people just talk about interaction on the local scale, but we have to think about all these different scales. Who does that? Yeah, maybe we'll find out tomorrow. Do only populist parties speak out? I think there is a clinging to the old script, and that's what we've seen with Hillary Clinton. I think that's one of the main reasons why Donald Trump won. He was the most unpopular candidate of all times, together with Hillary Clinton, and he didn't win because he was popular, more popular. He was less unpopular, right? So people stayed home. It's not actually that we have a surge on the right wing, but we have a falling away of support, especially among those who didn't benefit from globalization, minorities, the white middle class that benefited from the Fordist Compromise and now sees itself under pressure. And then, of course, we have all these identity questions that are important as well. So, yeah, how to make sense of this. Do only populist parties speak out? Well, what we found very surprising in our analysis is that progressive authors, academics, and also more public authors, analyzed the crisis of democracy very accurately, even before 2007, but at the latest after the financial crisis. There were many people arguing that if inequalities deepen more, there will be a problem with social cohesion. There will be the rise of authoritarian figures and populists. So this kind of analysis was standing. But there seems to be a problem with the transmission belt, or we're taking ourselves maybe too important as academics, or somehow the analysis didn't lead to any kind of political action. And so I think people are sticking to the script.
Well, thank you both for those rich, quite longer reflections than I had anticipated when I said we would have 2 rounds of questions. We're already 5 minutes past the closing time. Let me just say one thing that I'm taking away from this discussion is the importance of the insistence on not giving up the political ground, because if there is a possibility of member stateness that you raised, if there's a possibility of thinking again in big concepts about how to redress some of the historical issues that have come up, it has to be fought, as we've heard today, it has to be fought on the ground and to gain a kind of legitimacy among many different populations and groups in the political field as well as in the economics field. So I think that certainly it becomes clear how important discussions like this and movement from, as you said, analysis of problems to proactive responses to problems is, and certainly that is something that as university professors, we sometimes can be a bit shy about, but I think it's really an exciting moment to think about shifting those paradigms. So thank you very much to everyone, and I invite you to join our reception just outside.